From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Kamala Harris goes to the U.S.-Mexico border to give a speech. What did she say and what didn't she say? Plus, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz get ready to take the stage tonight in New York for this year's vice presidential debate, which might also be the last debate of the 2024 campaign. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Bill McGurn. Kamala Harris was in Douglas, Arizona on Friday, meeting with Border Patrol officers, walking a section of the fencing between the United States and Mexico, and of course, giving a political speech. Here is part of what she said.
And as president, I won't only bring back the border security bill that Donald Trump tanked. I will do more to secure our border. To reduce illegal border crossings, I will take further action to keep the border closed between ports of entry. Those who cross our borders unlawfully will be apprehended and removed and barred from reentering for 5 years. We will pursue more severe criminal charges against repeat violators.
She also said this, let me be clear, I reject the false choice that suggests we must either choose between securing our border or creating a system of immigration that is safe, orderly, and humane. We can and must do both. Let's listen also to a clip of her Republican opponent, Donald Trump, at a rally in Wisconsin responding to the vice president's border visit.
I watched this show that she put on. 4 years of the most incompetent border anywhere in the world in history. Kamala Harris traveled to the scene. In fact, she stood near where I put up border wall. That was her backdrop. And in one of the most heinous crimes ever committed by any administration in American history, that's what she did by allowing these millions of people, millions and millions of people, to come through our border and make our civilization very unsafe.
Monet, what did you make of the vice president's speech in Arizona on Friday and the political argument that she's trying to make now that we're within just a few weeks, several weeks of the 2024 November election?
Well, I think the most notable thing about Harris's border speech is the fact that she gave it all and went down to the border and was willing to be on camera there and draw attention to the issue, because for the entire campaign up until that point, her main strategy on the immigration issue was to completely dodge it altogether. Of course, it's quite well known that she was named a border czar by President Biden early in his administration and put in charge of the administration's policies of trying to reduce the flow. And obviously, that went extremely poorly. We've seen unauthorized crossings rise to record levels under the Biden presidency. So she tried to dodge that altogether and basically tried to have immigration be as small of an issue as possible in the campaign. But if you look at the polls, immigration is consistently ranking as the second biggest issue among voters after only the economy. And it's also Harris's worst issue in particular. It is the only issue in several polls in which she actually is given lower ratings than Joe Biden. And so she realizes that she has a lot of ground to make up there if she wants to be competitive, especially in a swing state like Arizona, which is facing the brunt of the border problem. So she went out and basically said that the blame for the border crossings that we see comes mostly from Republicans because they failed to embrace this bill that President Biden supported, which would have given him more authority to reduce daily crossings. Of course, that negates the fact that President Biden actually does have direct authority to mandate that crossings only take place at ports of entry. That's one of the things in the bill. And he just went ahead and did that on his own after they failed to get congressional approval for it. And so that is one of many things that shows that the Biden administration, including Kamala Harris, have always had more power to reduce the flow of migration, but they wanted to have a Republican sign-on to do it in order to protect themselves against criticisms from the left. And they are now trying to blame Republicans for letting the problem drag on. But I think that ordinary voters can see that there was quite a lot that Biden and Harris themselves were able to do, but were unwilling to confront until very recently.
Bill, part of what I think is remarkable about the vice president's position here is she is now the nominee for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is being eased off into into retirement, and yet she is unwilling to put much space at all between her and the sitting Democratic president. She did not go down to the border and say, I've faithfully served Joe Biden, but I think that he made certain mistakes. I think that we should have done this differently. There was no oops, there was no sorry. I agree with Monet. This was an attempt to shift the blame onto Republicans, although I don't think that is going to work given what people remember about how the border was before President Biden came into office, and then his taking the White House and saying, for instance, that he was going to end the Title 42 expulsion policy, moving to end the Remain in Mexico policy that President Trump had negotiated. And then they saw the result with their own eyes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with everything Monet said. Look, it's very cynical. Kamala Harris was appointed to whatever position you call it, root causes czar or border czar, for one reason. That's like appointing a commission. For Joe Biden to be able to say, I'm doing something about the border and shift the responsibility. That's all she's done. I haven't seen a report, even if you buy the idea she was about root causes. What has she discovered in all those years? She's ignored the border. She went there as vice president early on after she was basically forced. And then she went last week. I think it was a calamity for her because I don't think she can persuade anyone it's Republicans' fault. She was a point person on it. Illegal immigration increased dramatically under her watch. I think she's looking at that. I think Monet alluded to this in the polls and looking at a swing state like Arizona and says, I got to do something. I'm getting killed. But I don't think going to the border, it opened her to ridicule, and for Trump to strike back, I don't think it persuaded anyone. Any independent looking at this, do they really think Kamala Harris will be tougher than Joe Biden or tougher than Donald Trump? I don't think so.
Monet, does the vice president have a point, though, about this Lankford bill, this bill negotiated by Oklahoma Senator James Lankford? I mean, the Journal's editorials supported that legislation before it collapsed, and one of the arguments was that it made changes to the statutory law, including raising the standard for claiming asylum in the United States. And while I don't think that Kamala Harris is going to be able to persuade voters that the failure of that bill is responsible for the failures at the border, most of which preceded even the drawing up of that piece of legislation. It does seem to me that there is a kernel of a point here that a lot of these things that need to be done to rationalize U.S. immigration law are things that, despite efforts over many years, a president and an administration cannot do on their own without some kind of act of Congress actually changing the underlying law.
That's exactly true. And I think you laid out the contours of the debate over the bill exactly right, in the sense that there's no doubt it would have been an incremental improvement over the status quo. For context, this bill was negotiated in preparation for the end of Title 42. So this was the authority that President Trump had put in place, that President Biden had extended for some time, that allowed asylum claimants to be turned away from the border during the COVID period. Of course, they lost that emergency authority at a certain point and realized it's going to be a lot easier for more migrants to be able to come and claim asylum. So we need to put new measures in place to make sure we can control the flow. And it would have made it harder to earn asylum in this country by lifting the standard. It required people to only enter at ports of entry, and it would have placed daily limits on the number of people who can come in. Republicans who say that they're serious about controlling the border, including Donald Trump, had every reason to support that bill as an incremental improvement. The reason that they didn't, they say, is because they didn't think President Biden would enforce a lot of the measures in it. But still, obviously, you want to put it into law and put pressure on the president to comply and move in an incrementally better direction. But of course, none of this means that Kamala Harris is correct to say that the entire problem that we see today can be pinned on the failure of that bill, because border crossings were already reaching record levels by that time. And there were quite a lot of other policies that were in the administration's power to implement that they declined to do. One of the biggest ones is the Trump policy of requiring all migrants to seek asylum in a third country that they pass through en route to the U.S. That's something that the Biden administration canceled and then re-implemented in part, but they didn't require it for every single migrant the way that President Trump did. And so anyone who looks at the policies that have affected border crossings has to say that the Biden administration has a lot of direct responsibility for it, the negotiated bill completely aside.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Meantime, the failures of the Biden and Harris policy on the border have made that kind of compromise and rationalization of immigration law even harder, it seems to me, Bill. And this is also reflected in some of the polling. Gallup has been asking Americans for years now. Here's the question. In your view, should immigration be kept at its present level, increased, or decreased? And if you go back to May 2020, present level is 36%. Increase 34%, decrease 28%. So roughly 1/3 each for each of these views. And now it is completely the opposite. 55% telling Gallup that they want the level of immigration decreased, only 16% saying increased, which is a challenge, Bill, for people who believe in legal immigration, believe in programs letting people come in and work when American companies need workers.
I couldn't agree more. No one has done more damage to legal immigration than Joe Biden and the Democrats by discrediting it. People are fed up with the lies they've been told, and they just want to stop. And that means right now they're not interested in how many people that we should let in. They want the problem to stop. And even the Democratic cities are complaining about being overwhelmed. I mean, this is a problem with the Biden-Harris thing. The Lankford bill, I think, was correct, would marginally improve things. But people don't trust it because what was the purpose of the Lankford bill? It was to get Republican sign-on to an effort that bolstered Joe Biden's line that the immigration problem was because he lacked certain powers that Congress was reluctant to give him, and not because of the own steps that he took that fomented this great increase. So what I worry about is, has this poisoned the well for any future resolution? You know, I was in the Bush White House when the compromise of 2007 just blew up in our faces. We had bipartisan agreement, and among the people that sabotaged it was Barack Obama. And so there are a lot of people on both sides don't want the problem stopped.
Meantime, in New York, the vice presidential candidates are getting set to debate on CBS tonight. J.D. Vance and Tim Walz preparing to take the stage. The microphones reportedly will be on, no mute button, as there was during the last presidential debate. Some fact-checking online, but CBS making clear that they are expecting the candidates, for the most part, to fact-check themselves. Bill, your column in the Journal today is under the headline, How J.D. Vance Wins the Vice Presidential Debate with Tim Walz. Give listeners a sense of the argument you're making there.
It's very simple, Kyle. Don't let Tim Walz make the debate about Trump. J.D. Vance has to force a debate about the Biden record and hang it around the necks of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. I think that's what he has to do in every question. She's running away from that record, running away from her own policy statements, and he has to call her on it. This is the last national moment before the election for him to do that. Donald Trump didn't do that largely at his own debate. He too often took the bait from Kamala Harris. He got some points in, but a lot of that debate was about Trump. He has to make this about Kamala Harris.
Monet, what do you expect tonight? I think probably many voters have seen a bit from each of these vice presidential candidates, but particularly Tim Walz, maybe he's flown a little bit more under the radar, hasn't been doing a lot of interviews, whereas J.D. Vance seems like he is ready to go on any talk show at a moment's notice at the drop of a hat. So it will be interesting to see whether that practice shows and whether Tim Walz shows up as prepared as Kamala Kamala Harris seemed to be at her recent debate with Donald Trump.
Yes, I think that it's going to be a deeply personal debate. I think that both of these candidates have shown over the course of the campaign that they have a flair for personal attacks, and it's part of their style, and it's part of why they were picked, to be frank, to be able to make some of these negative statements about the other side that are a little bit unbecoming for the person at the top of the ticket. They were hired essentially as attack dogs. And I think that Walz was picked in part because of his criticisms of J.D. Vance during that period when Kamala was looking to select a running mate. He was the person who first tagged Vance and Trump as being weird and has continued to make those sorts of attacks part of his brand. On the other side, I think you'll see J.D. Vance coming out strong against Walz's military service record. Of course, it's now known by a lot of voters that Walz resigned from his reserve unit just before they were going to be deployed overseas into a war zone. And he's had some misstatements about the record of his service. And Vance, as a veteran himself, has the standing to be able to bring that to the fore. So I do think, as Bill mentioned, there's a big task for them in terms of defining the other's political position. Walz has to try to defend the Biden record. Vance has the much easier job, I think, of attacking the Biden record and tying Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to it. But I think that they're not going to be able to resist the temptation to make it very personal. I think that they genuinely dislike each other. They're vying to be the representative of a certain kind of working and middle class Midwestern politician who they hope will have a lot of appeal in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so they're going to try to destroy one another. And it could create some very entertaining fireworks, or it could create a lot of really ugly barbs that they're exchanging with one another.